welcome into episode 75 of The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. I'm Ken Ray.
I'm Nicholas Raba.
And I'm Nicholas Tacek.
A grab bag today, a jumble, a veritable potpourri of stories await you on this edition of The Checklist. There have been a few topics to come up recently that we wanted to be sure to share with you, but none of them were really big enough for a show of their own. Ingredients in today's jambalaya: a bug worthy of Groundhog Day, a Windows malware being ported to Mac OS, video game vulnerabilities, yet another piece of Mac malware services, and finally a follow-up to a story on the fate of the fruit fly author, which sounds like an Encyclopedia Brown story, but is in fact a information security story. Let's start first of all with the bug worthy of Groundhog Day.
Basically, what it came down to is you needed to watch the links that you clicked when you are using Messages app on iOS and macOS. In mid-January, a Twitter user posted a link that could be used to cause problems on both Mac and iOS devices. If the link is clicked within the Messages app, it causes the app to crash and can result in some weird behavior on iOS devices. Now, the person who discovered the bug said that he notified Apple before publishing the exploit publicly, but did so to make a point so that Apple would take those type of bugs more seriously. The exploit wasn't malicious this time around, but that might not always be the case in the future. And no, despite the fact that it was recently Groundhog Day in the United States, you're not experiencing deja vu. Bugs like these are discovered from time to time, and occasionally they're discovered by pranksters who go on to spread the exploit link far and wide. We most recently covered this type of vulnerability as part of our 2017 Apple Security Year in Review. The last time we saw that type of bug, it was causing messages to freeze up when receiving specifically crafted emojis that couldn't handle correctly. And you can learn more about this in episode 71 of the checklist.
Let me ask a couple of questions really quickly. So, what was it promising? I mean, I would get this link. Is it just because, well, a friend of mine sent me this link, so I would automatically do that? Or was it saying big cash, lots of prices? I mean,
It was up to the sender. In this case, the guy who posted on Twitter said, "Here's a link. Send this link to your friends." It was a link on GitHub, which is a source code repository. Basically, it was up to whatever pranksters or whatever you wanted to do to trick your friends and family and coworkers and people who you wanted to hate you. Basically, you had to choose what worked best. And in this case, it was rather benign in the sense that when stuff like this happens, when Messages is crashing, it's a bug. It's a bug being exploited, and sometimes bugs being exploited are used to cause worse things happen than just have the program crash.
Did anybody send you the link?
No, but I know we talked about it, and I think you said you sent it to people.
Yeah,
to test it.
Yeah, I sent it, to test it out to see what would happen. And the first thing that happened when I sent the link is it crashed my own Messages app because the preview functions within Messages tried to render it. And so it crashed on me as well. So I'm like, oh man, it wasn't just the person who was receiving it at the time. If it starts trying to render when you bring up the message or window, then it crashes it. It would take it to its knees.
And the one we talked about in episode 71, I remember one of the problems we discussed was the fact that since Messages wants to go ahead and automatically preview stuff, I mean, you said at the top, be careful what you click on. But I mean, even if you just looked at the message, which you're going to do because somebody's sending you a message, I mean, was this crashing just when you received the link, or did you actually have to actively tap on it?
Every time that I tested it, it was the way it would render it. So I didn't have to click it myself, but that could have been the way that that my apps were set up to preview the links and things like that.
Okay. I've got one last question. You said in there that luckily this was fairly benign, but it could have been used for something worse. How could it have been used for something worse exactly? I mean, if the exploit is you see this or you tap on this and it crashes your phone, I mean, what might have happened instead?
Well, generally with the way exploits work is when a bad guy, or I guess a good security researcher, when somebody discovers a bug that can cause a program to crash, it's sometimes possible to use that as a starting point, saying, okay, I know that something in that program is trying to do something and it's not handling this data correctly. In this case, it's just crashing, but in other cases, you could tweak the data that you're feeding into the program to cause essentially cause a buffer overflow and get the program to do something else that it's not normally supposed to be doing. Sometimes those kind of bugs can be the in that you need to cause more havoc. In this case, the guy found out that it crashed messages and said, hey, that's good enough for me, and posted it publicly, I guess after alerting Apple. But if you, depending on the bug, it's possible that you could kind of do further research and see if you could get it to do something else instead of just crashing randomly without any, other bells and whistles. You could craft the exploit code in such a way to cause it to do other stuff. And that's kind of depends on the level of sophistication of the attacker, how much time and effort they're willing to put into research, the type of bug they actually discovered. Some bugs, you can't do much more than just make a program crash. But in other cases, you could make it more dangerous.
And then, like, in the heat of the moment, when this is happening and people are looking for solutions to correct it, they tend to go to social media. And I saw a couple links out there where people were like, here, guys, here's the solution to fix it. And guess what? It wasn't the solution to fix it. I mean, it's social engineering because people are looking for a solution and people are taking advantage of the opportunity there.
This is one of those things where Ken, some other examples of bad stuff that could happen. A long time ago, there used to be a website called Jailbreak Me, or jailbreak.me, I believe. And you just had to visit the website and it could jailbreak your iPhone remotely. This was back in the day when jailbreaks were pretty easy to come by.
Yeah. No, that was actually one of the earliest ones, wasn't it?
It was.
Yeah.
And then a more recent example was the Pegasus, I believe it was a Pegasus exploit, a couple years ago, where it was a piece of spyware, actually, and the way it would get onto a device is it was very specifically targeted, and it targeted a human rights activist in this case, and the bad guy sent him a link in messages, and if he had clicked that link and followed through with it, it would have, the way it worked was some zero-day exploits that basically would have jailbroken his phone and installed spyware. So that's what we meant when we said this one was rather benign compared to what it could have been.
Third week of January, Apple released just a slew of software updates for, I guess, everything. Was this something that was taken care of in that round of updates?
It was, yeah. And if you haven't updated to 10.13.3 and you happen to still get that link, there was multiple solutions for taking care of the issue, as far as even blocking the website that it links to. Of course, you could update your operating system to take care of the issue. But alternatively, once your app, you're able to relaunch it again, rather than clicking on the message and reloading the preview of it, just deleting that whole message dialogue altogether by right-clicking, option-clicking, swiping to the right on your phone, whatever way works, you could just delete it all. Of course, you're going to delete all your previous conversations with the person, but if they sent you that link in the first place, maybe you want to delete the conversation.
Let's move on to something that was specifically for, I was going to say specifically for desktops, but desktops, laptops, specifically for the Mac, a case of some Windows malware actually being moved over to Mac OS.
Yeah, it didn't take very long for the first Mac malware of 2018 to appear. In early January, security researcher Patrick Wardle called attention to a new piece of Mac malware, which he named OS 10 Mummy. And basically, the malware acts primarily as a DNS hijacker. but it also has the ability to take screenshots, generate simulated mouse events, download and upload files, execute commands, the general behavior that we've seen in Mac malware lately. In this case, though, it did some other stuff that was a little more unique, including installing a new security certificate in the system keychain on Mac OS, which would also changed the DNS server settings, which are used to correlate a domain name such as apple.com with an IP address, which those are basically the sets of numbers that are used by computers to route traffic on the internet. And basically, by hijacking the DNS server settings on your computer, this piece of malware could essentially control where your internet traffic goes and could easily pretend to be your banking website, grab your credentials. It's something called a man-in-the-middle attack. And so the interesting part about this piece of malware, though, is that it appears to share a number of similarities with an existing piece of Windows malware, which is known as DNS Unlocker. Now, DNS Unlocker and Mommy both use very similar IP addresses for the hijacked DNS servers. It looked like they most likely resided actually on the same network, controlled by the same malware author. A security certificate used by both DNS Unlocker and Mommy is exactly the same. And it looks like DNS Unlocker did come out back in 2015 and only infected Windows machines back then, but the similarities kind of point to the fact that Mommy is most likely a version of DNS Unlocker that has been fully rewritten to run on Mac OS. And once again, it's showing that those Windows malware authors are kind of taking a look at the Mac platform in more depth, and we're seeing this more and more frequently where Windows malware is essentially ported over to the Mac platform because it's become lucrative enough for the bad guys to make it worthwhile for them.
Macs are cool, man.
and people are willing to spend a lot of money. It actually I've never understood why there wasn't more malware for the Mac from the beginning, because even though there were fewer of them back in the day, they cost a lot more money back in the day as well. So if I was willing to spend $3,000 on a laptop, whereas other people were only spending $800, I would think you would want to attack me because I apparently think I have $3,000 to spend on a computer.
Or maybe you've spent all your money and now you have nothing left to spend.
Yeah, that's a possibility. There's a weird thing, though, about this, and I don't know if we're talking psychology or just, what they had time to get to, but you say this was malware that came out in 2015 for the Windows side. They're now releasing it, or it's now hitting in early 2018 on the Mac side. I mean, is this just, they just finally got around to it, or is it because the Mac is still growing, or... I mean, I don't guess we'll ever actually know exactly why they're doing it. Probably the scary thing is this is something that seemed to have been taken care of a couple of years ago, and yet now it's showing up in a completely different place to what we've talked about before is a largely unsuspecting population, because even though we all know that Macs get malware, we also all know that Macs don't get malware.
Exactly. You have a user base that's been kind of trained to believe the opposite of what's true. And they're definitely more vulnerable in that sense because they're, I'm bulletproof. I'm on a Mac. I don't have to worry about anything. Oh, look, I got infected with something.
I don't click links.
Especially Windows malware. That's the thing. I mean, I've heard about that DNS Unlocker, but that's a Windows thing and I'm on a Mac. So even if you're like fairly hip, and I know information security is not hip, but even if you're fairly hip to what's going on, I'm sorry, guys. Information security is very hip. I apologize.
It's very hip.
It is very cool. You even got T-shirts.
Times are changing, man. Times are changing.
Yes. My point is, though, even if you're aware of what's going on, you might look at that and say, yeah, but that's a Windows thing. I'm good. That's a Windows thing, not a me thing. But that's why we keep up with news, because, it changes. Let's move on to... I'm always bummed when I hear about stuff going bad in games because, games are just, used to just be fun. I mean, certainly they're becoming bigger and bigger business now to the point that there are leagues of people playing games and people sitting watching other people play video games, which sounds like something from a William Gibson novel. Additionally, though, there's lots of money in games and of course, there are vulnerabilities in games as well. What's the latest big one that's ended up on your radar?
Oh, yeah, we don't normally think about video games as being potential sources of security vulnerabilities. They're just games, right?
It used to be.
I use them. I know. I use them to relax and get away from all the security stuff. But no, can't have nice things. Tavis Ormandy, a well-known vulnerability researcher at Google, posted a link on Twitter to a bug report regarding a vulnerability present in all Blizzard games. And for non-video game players, Blizzard is a pretty huge video game company and has created some of the most well-known video games of all time, including World of Warcraft, Diablo, StarCraft, and Overwatch. Now, Activision, they purchased Blizzard a few years back. They provide information on their user base to prospective investors. And in this case, that's including the number of users on their platforms, which happens to be about 500 million monthly active users for Blizzard. And so that's a lot of people who are potentially impacted by this bug, to say the least. So what does a video game vulnerability look like? In this case, there is a small program called the Blizzard Update Agent that is constantly running in the background on any system that has Blizzard games installed. This utility is used to do things like install, uninstall, update, change settings on Blizzard games, basically anything that has to do with maintaining those Blizzard games that are installed on the machine. And the utility needs a way to communicate with the main game to do those things, and has a custom authentication scheme built in to make sure that the commands are coming from a legitimate source. Except, as Tavis discovered, it didn't protect against a specific type of attack known as DNS rebinding. With DNS rebinding, any website can create a DNS name that they're authorized to communicate with, and then make it point to localhost, that is to say, the computer itself. And that means that any website can send privileged commands to the Blizzard Update Agent, which is really bad because that means that a bunch of external websites could have control over the stuff that's running on your computer. Now, in this case, the vulnerability was thankfully discovered by one of the good guys. But what if it had been discovered by someone with less than honest intentions? What kind of damage could be caused then? Well, Tavis actually laid that out. Exploitation would involve network drives or changing the download location used by the Blizzard Update Agent and using it to download and install malicious data and configuration files. Blizzard had been communicating with Tavis regarding the bug, but after they stopped replying to emails and released a patch, the private bug report was released publicly, which is when the world found out about this issue. And it turns out that the patch didn't quite solve everything, and Blizzard then posted saying, oh, no, we're still working on a fix. And about 3 days after that, they did release a new version of Blizzard Update Agent, which did contain the fixes necessary to prevent the vulnerability from being exploited at that point.
So you think they were just like beta testing the fix, working with their engineers on stuff? Do you think he really felt like shut out where he was like, okay, now I'm going to release it?
Well, there were a couple things there. The way that those, with Google Project Zero and stuff like that, the way that the bug reports work, they'll keep a bug report private for 90 days. That's the norm, if a company doesn't ask for an extension. If the company releases after 90 days, or if a company releases a patch, like a widespread patch to address the exploit, then the private bug report will be made public. It's just the way it goes. Apparently, what Blizzard is claiming is that what Tavis construed as the update patch was unrelated. It was something else they had been working on, and it was a miscommunication where they stopped talking to him and happened to release a patch at the same time that he thought was supposed to address it. So it sounds like there was some confusion on both sides there.
Whoops.
Yeah. So I'm not really sure where the truth lies in that, but the way that when you have a lot of security professionals do adhere to a kind of keep this bug private till the company can get a fix out, it's something called responsible disclosure. And it's kind of a hot topic when it comes to, or I guess it's a hot button topic when it comes to security professionals, because some people will say, release all the details right away. Let everybody know there's a vulnerability, and other people say, oh no, let the company try and fix it first, keep things under wraps. Unfortunately, then some companies will just keep asking for extensions for months and months and months, and depending on how frustrated the security researcher gets, they might go ahead and release the details anyway.
Do you happen to know, because Blizzard doesn't just work on computers, it also works on consoles, was this something that was specific to computers, or would it have also affected things like the Xbox?
This, the bug report did not specify there. It was looking at Windows in particular in this case, but the Mac, I guess from what I read, the Mac was also vulnerable in this case because they also use the Blizzard update agent and same communication authentication issue right there. As far as like Xbox and stuff like that goes, I'm not certain how, because the games are it's kind of a different setup on those.
They're not exactly sandboxed, but they're also not as open as installing a game on a PC.
Yeah, and it's not like technically the games are like different programs and you can have multiple things running, but you generally have like one game running at a time on your Xbox. So I'm not certain if there's I think that I'm almost positive the updates are either part of the Microsoft's Xbox operating system itself or the games themselves. And, it's not something where it's another app that is running in the background to keep things up to date. I don't think it works the same way on consoles as it does on desktop and laptop computers.
Back to more traditional malware, I suppose, or back to more traditional vulnerabilities. There was another piece of Mac malware that you guys wanted to be sure to tell people about.
Yeah, another Mac malware threat was publicly identified in January 2018. And once again, it was a piece of cross-platform malware that targeted Microsoft Windows and Mac OS, as well as Linux. Crossrat was discovered by the EFF in conjunction with Lookout Security and is one of the tools used by the Dark Caracal cyber espionage group. Dark Caracal has been conducting a global espionage campaign at a nation-state level, and its targets include governments, militaries, utility companies, financial institutions, manufacturing companies, and defense contractors. Now, the regions that have been targeted by Dark Caracal include North America, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia.
So almost everywhere. Australia's cool, apparently, and the Arctic and the Antarctic, but otherwise, everybody.
Hey, stop giving people ideas. Now, Crossrat is a piece of spyware that is written in Java, which enables it to run on multiple platforms. It has the ability to manipulate the file system, take screenshots, open files, and run arbitrary executables. According to the EFF and Lookout, the attackers are relying on the old standby of phishing to infect their victims, though in some cases, physical access has been used to compromise targeted systems. Now, thankfully, most Mac users are protected from this malware by default, as macOS doesn't ship with Java installed by default anymore.
And just so I'm clear, you said these were like nation-state level attacks. They sound, am I right in thinking they sound fairly targeted, or did I miss something there? Like if you work for a federal agency or the NSA or a bank, it sounds like you have to be more important than me to be a victim of this.
Yeah, this one was, again, fairly well targeted. And the fact, yes, Macs don't come with Java installed by default anymore, but there are still a lot of companies and businesses that need some sort of Java application to run on their hardware. So, you might not have, whereas at home you have control over what you install on your computer, you might not have that control at your workplace. But again, yeah, this one was one of those, we're going to specifically targeted some, really important people, companies, that kind of stuff, and not so much your home user. So this isn't something that most Mac users, listeners of the show, would have to worry about.
Well, why don't we end on something, I don't want to say uplifting, because I think it ends with somebody going to jail. And yet, maybe we can wrap up with a sort of G.I. Joe, crime doesn't pay kind of message. What happened to the guy behind Fruit Fly?
Yeah, you might recall that piece of malware named Fruit Fly, which we most recently discussed back in episode 71 of the checklist. If you do need a refresher, here are the important details. It was discovered back in early January 2017, so about a year ago, but it used some rather antiquated code techniques, which led security researchers at the time to deduce that it had been around for a while before it had been discovered. It was able to capture screenshots, access the webcam, had some basic remote control functionality, able to communicate with a command and control server, do all this stuff from any infected Mac. And at the time of discovery, security researchers basically thought it appeared to be purpose-built for corporate espionage. And it turns out it wasn't some shadowy cabal behind this particular piece of malware. In fact, it was just some kid who happened to get away with infecting people with his custom-built malware for somewhere in the neighborhood of 14 years. I mean, just stop and think about that for a second. That was 14 years that this particular piece of malware was completely undetected on Mac, on the Mac platform.
Well, hold on a second. You say it was some kid, but this malware had been around for 14 years. He may have been a kid when he wrote it, but he's not a kid anymore.
Yeah. No. The malware author created Fruitfly as a teenager and kept improving upon it as the years went by, as he infected thousands of unsuspecting users. And he was 28 when he was finally busted. He used the malware to collect usernames and passwords, tax records, medical documents, bank statements, all of which are the things that hackers normally look for. But he also went beyond the norm, and he made off with Google searches, private offline communications, and photographs. And he set up the malware to log keystrokes and keep an eye out for words associated with pornography. And he'd then get notified by the malware when a victim typed something in that matched the criteria. And he is alleged to have collected child pornography using his malware as well. And it turns out that he was actually arrested shortly after the Fruitfly malware was discovered back in January 2017. So he's been sitting in jail for a year. It took the feds a while to gather all the information necessary for their case against him, considering it was a rather huge number of victims that had been infected with the malware. A 16-count federal indictment against him was filed in early January 2018, and he now faces up to 20 years in prison.
So with all this information that he was gathering, like, in the documents, did it say that he was using people's information?
From the reports I read, he was keeping really detailed logs of his voyeurism, as it were, which just helped the feds with their case. But they charged him with stuff like identity theft, I believe. So it sounds like he was using some of that information he found for financial gain or whatever, beyond just the pornography side of things. So, I guess in the end, he infected some, I think it was a school, like a college he went to school at or something like that. And that's what led the initial tip off. And then when security researchers were connecting to the command and control server, they were able to kind of, backtrace to all these victims. That's when they started noticing, a large number of, I think it was Ohio, was a large number of victims, and they kind of went out from there. And that was a year ago in January 2017. And then the case just snowballed from there, and he got busted. So that was one of those rare incidents where one of these Mac malware authors is actually identified and potentially goes to prison. Normally, we see these various malware threats crop up. They infect some Macs. Security people become aware of them, take the steps to take down the servers and everything like that. But the bad guy essentially walks free.
Yeah, you don't really hear about it. Yeah,
you don't really hear about the busts very often. Exactly.
I really want to see the David Fincher movie about this guy. I know that sounds crazy, but I mean there's so much in that story that's weird and sad and like Bond villain level, but at the same time, it's like being a Bond villain knocking over a 7-Eleven. In a way, there's something. Man, that's a weird story. Although, who knows? I mean, as you say, maybe they're all just that weird because we don't usually find out who's behind them, right?
Yeah,
maybe there are 1,000 Bond villains knocking over 7-Elevens all across the country and around the world. That's a lot of big stories boiled down into just a few minutes. But if you would like to know more about those stories, we have a lot more for you to find out. SecureMac.com/checklist is the place to find that. Notes for every show that's come before and every show that's coming after this one, once they actually come out. SecureMac.com/checklist is the place to check. If you have a question you'd like to ask us or a topic you'd like to hear us hit, our email address is checklist@securemac.com. The address again is checklist@securemac.com. And if you can't remember that, please do remember this. You're listening to The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. And we'll talk to you next week.